Shavua Tov, some of the words of Torah which we spoke in our synagogue this Shabbat. We need to say thank you to all the Noahs in the world, because Noahs are very important, and Noah was a great tzaddik, and we know that Noah saved the human race. But we need to understand more about just who Noach was. Now, Noach, or Noah, I'm going to call him Noach. It's easier to say Noach. That's the translation of the word. Easy, Noach. The rabbis have a disagreement about just how big a righteous man was Noach, because the Torah says he was a righteous man in his generations. So some rabbis interpret this as a praise. If in his generations, a time when the whole world was corrupt, he was still a tzaddik, had he lived in a generation of tzaddikim, all the more so he would have been a tzaddik. And there are those who say, no, it's really not a compliment. It's a bit of a denigration. It's a little bit of a diminution of Noach's quality, that in his generation, where compared to everybody else, he was a tzaddik because the rest of the people were horribly corrupt, and he was okay. So in his generation, he's a tzaddik. But had he lived in the time, for example, of Abraham, he wouldn't have been considered anything special at all. So there is that opinion. And I have to say that second opinion is a little bit difficult, because how can you say something bad about a man who is described by the Torah as having found favor in God's eyes, as being a tzaddik, tamim haya b'dorotav, pure, he was a righteous man, pure in his generations? How can you say a bad word about such a person? We'll have to understand that, and then we'll get into that a little bit more. Although the opinion that says that he would have been considered a nothing in the time of Abraham, that does make sense. I have two indications of that. One is a Mishnah in the Tractate of Avot, which says expressly the difference between Noach and Abraham, that Noach could not save his generation, that the generations were making God angry until he brought the flood and destroyed them. So Noach did not save his generation, just a representative sample of the human race and all of the other species, so that the world should continue, but he didn't save the vast majority of the population. But Abraham saved his generation. Abraham came and received reward for all of the people that had been sinning, meaning he atoned for the whole generation and saved the world. So the rabbis already see that Abraham was a greater righteous person than Noach. So I understand that you can say perhaps that Noach is less than he might appear in terms of his righteousness. Another proof is actually a fact. If you add up the ages of all of the generations from Noah to Abraham, when they had children, you will see that Noah was alive for at least the first 50 years of Abraham's life. So he was in Abraham's generation, and nobody mentions him. So there you have it, proof that he wouldn't be considered anything, because he wasn't. You could say that Abraham, hadn't yet hit his stride. He only became famous after he turned 75 years old, and by then Noach was indeed gone. But nonetheless, let's understand the righteousness of Noach, and let's see if we can understand this whole idea of how do we understand what he would have been in the time of Abraham, and why is it a denigration? The word denigration, genai, is used. There are some who interpret Noach's being a righteous man in his generations as a genai, a denigration, a diminution. And how can you say that about somebody who the Torah describes as he found favor in God's eyes? He's a tzaddik tamim, a perfectly pure, righteous man. So there's one Hasidic Rebbe, the Amshin of a Rebbe, who used to say on the Rashi that what does Rashi say? There are some of our rabbis who interpret this to praise Noach, and there are some who interpret it to criticize Noach. And the Amshin Rebbe would say those who would criticize Noach, they're not our rabbis. It only says our rabbis by the ones who praise. That's a humorous idea, but let's understand it a little better. Noach was the lucky recipient of good parenting. Now, parenting was a very unsure skill in those early generations. Perhaps for this reason, humanity is called Enoshut. Why Enoshut, not Adamut? Because Enosh was the son of Shet. He was the grandson of Adam and Chava. And until his time, there certainly hadn't been proper understanding of parenting, because Adam and Eve had no parents of the human race. Their parent was God, and they didn't have human parents who knew how to guide them about being human beings, so they didn't have an example, and therefore they didn't know what they were doing. So they brought up Cain and Hevel, and that didn't quite turn out as good as it could have. Perhaps because Adam and Chava didn't have the parenting skills, because there was no one to teach it to them. And Cain and Hevel, so Shet comes along, and he has a kid, Enosh. It's already now 3 generations, Adam and Chava, Shet, and now Enosh, 3 generations. When something happens 3 times, we say it's called a Chazaka. It already becomes established. So by the time of Enosh, Enosh already should have known how to be a good parent or a reasonable parent, and so therefore we were all called the children of Enosh, because these were the first people to have an actual parent. That's an interesting idea. At any rate, Lemech, the father of Noach, he was a successful parent. It says when Noach was born that Lemech named him Noach with an accompanying phrase or statement, Ze yenachamenu, this one will comfort us, mima'asenu, from our deeds, u'me'itzvon yadenu, and from the anger or the frustration or the difficulty of our hands, min ha'adama, because of the land, asher eirara Hashem, that God has cursed. In other words, making a living, getting crops to grow was a very difficult thing. The earth was not cooperating, and life was hard, and Noach was somehow going to be the harbinger of an improved ecosphere, of a better crops and better everything. And the rabbis in the Midrash say that Noach actually helped with technology. He invented the plow. Until Noach, they didn't have plows, so they had to do it all by hand, on their hands and knees, opening up the earth, putting the seeds in, closing the earth, watering it, doing everything. Noach made the planting part much easier because he invented the plow. Now, the usual interpretation is that this is simply a prophecy, that this child is going to bring in an era of improved human existence because of the crops. I believe that it's more a statement of parenting, that Lemech was not saying a prophecy, but he was saying, my goal for this child is that he's going to improve the world and improve the human race. In other words, Lemech, a parent, set a very direct goal of a life mission for his child. And that is the excellent parenting. When a parent helps a child find a life goal, a life mission, that's what is the key of parenting. And Noach was the beneficiary, and as a result, he saved the entire human race. Not bad at all. Now, Noach was a passive sort of a tzaddik. The word Noach means easy. He delayed, for example, in those generations, people gave birth at the ripe young age of 80, 90. Noach, 500, right? Can you imagine all his aunts when they meet at a wedding going to him saying, hey, Noach, no, when? A few more 100 years, don't worry. Noach was very passive. But he was a very deeply religious and spiritual man. He was a tzaddik, a very great tzaddik. But his tzidkut, his righteousness, was internal. It wasn't external. And that's why in the time of Abraham, Noach would not have been considered very much, because Abraham is out there making noise. He's building altars. He's calling in the name of God. He's having, Shabbatonim. And Noach is sitting at home saying Tehillim, or he's sitting at home being spiritual. So that doesn't mean that Noach wasn't a great tzaddik. He was just a different type. I noticed the difference is in the way they communicated with God. All the conversations between Noach and God are in one direction. God talks to Noach. Noach doesn't say a word. He is the most silent figure in all of Sefer Bereshit, in all of the book of Genesis. Whereas Abraham, he doesn't stop talking. He's always talking to God. He's dealing with God. He's bargaining with Sodom. Ulaya dabra achapam. I'll speak again. That's Abraham. Just different personalities. But where is that a gnai? Why is that a denigration or a diminution of Noach? I don't think it is. So another explanation of Noach's righteousness was that his particular mitzvah was feeding and helping others. And there you see it. He invents the plow. That helps the whole world to eat better, to survive better. He's in the ark. He's feeding the animals 24 hours a day. He's always on the call. So he's working his bones apart in order to feed and to help others. And he plants a vineyard after the flood to lift up people's spirits, because his family and he himself probably were deeply depressed. Their entire world had been destroyed. I'm sure they were not happy about that result. And wine cheers you up, so he planted a vineyard. He was trying his best to help whomever he could. And that was his righteousness. This idea comes from Rabbi Zalman Sorotzkin in his book Oznaim LaTorah. And that makes sense, because Noach was therefore somebody who helped people on a physical level, whereas Abraham helped on a spiritual level. And that's something that's very much part of Yiddishkeit. Our belief in the redemption is that first there's a physical redemption. First we left slavery in Egypt, and then a spiritual redemption. We went to Mount Sinai. and receive the Torah. So first the physical, and then the spiritual comes in. And the great Rabbi Yehuda Levi of Prague, the Maharal of Prague, foresaw almost prophetically the rise of the state of Israel in the same terms. That first there would be a physical state, not necessarily spiritual, not necessarily righteous, not even necessarily religious, but just a physical state where Jews would be in Eretz Israel and they would have self-determination. And then, once you have the physical framework, then the holiness can come in. Then the tzaddikim will come and they will take control, and then the Mashiach and the redemption will happen. We see this in the blessings of the weekday Amidah, the silent devotion. That first we say, Mekabetz Nidchei Amo Yisrael, gathers in all of the exiles of Israel. We're not asking who, just Jews, wherever they are spiritually. They come. Shivat Zion, the redemption started when the Aliyah first came in the 19th century. That's the first phase. Then we get political independence, and that's Melech Ohev Tzedakah Mishpat, the king who loves righteousness and justice, meaning that we have a government, our own rulers. And it doesn't say necessarily that those people putting in the justice and the laws are religious or are spiritual, just that they are Jewish. And that's the physical state. Then we can move towards spirituality by pushing aside the evil, Shovero Yavimu Machnia Zidin, breaking the enemies and destroying those who intentionally rebel against God. That's talking about the evil amongst the Jews, unfortunately. Not everybody of us is on the high spiritual level. And then the tzaddikim, Mishanu Miftach tzaddikim, then the righteous will come, and that will be already the state that we have dreamed of under spiritual Torah leadership. And what will that usher in? Bonei Yerushalayim, rebuilding Jerusalem, Matzmiach Keren Yeshua, causing the glow of the redemption to blossom. Shomea Tfilah, God will then hear our prayers, and Machazir Shechinato L'Tzion, return his presence to Zion, the Beit HaMikdash. So that's the way that things work. So you need a Noach to prepare for an Avraham. You need somebody who's going to take care of others physically, that they are well. And then you can have Avraham. You know, I kind of imagine a Shabbaton or a Kiruv event or a Kumzitz, where Avraham is out there in the spotlight and he's doing the sessions and he's inspiring people and teaching them and everybody's listening and he's singing along and it's great. And where is Noach? In the kitchen making the pizza. And that's no less important than what Avraham is doing. Each one of those things is part of a unified whole, and we need both of them. We need the body, the physical, and we need the spiritual. But the problem is that sometimes we overlook the physical. We overlook the soldiers who protect us. And yeah, you know what? I don't know that the soldiers are also religious. They may not be religious at all, some of them, and I know that some of them are very religious. It doesn't make a difference. They are all like Noach. They find favor in God's eyes. The police who protect us, are you telling me there are a couple of bad apples? I know. It happens. But that's still, they put their lives on the line to make sure that we're safe. They are Noachs. They find favor in God's eyes. Everybody, hospital workers, everybody who makes our physical existence better are like Noachs. They are giving to others, and that finds favor in God's eyes. And so therefore I think that the denigration, that's talking about the rabbis who denigrate Noah and say, had he lived in the generation of Abraham, he wouldn't have been considered anything. The denigration is not on Noah, it's on the generation. Oy to a generation that doesn't recognize and appreciate and thank the Noachs, the people who do all they can just to make sure that life is easier and better lived. Instead, we give all our attention to the Abrahams. Now, the Abrahams are critically important, and certainly they deserve praise, but the Noachs do too. And it's a genai, it's a denigration, a diminution of a generation if they don't recognize that. So therefore, we need to recognize that the Noachs among us are also critical. Shavuot Tov.